Today I am demonstrating another colored pencil portrait. Hi, I'm Lisa, the artist behind Lachri Fine Art. Today I'm demonstrating this little girl that I have drawn with colored pencils over an airbrushed background. I worked on Stonehenge paper, my airbrush paints were createx, and the colored pencils that I used were Luminance by Caran and Polychromos by Faber-Castell. For those of you who are supporters over on Patreon, the 2-hour version of this drawing is available for you guys to watch now, so make sure to head over there and check that out. Now let's get on to the tutorial. I've started off by airbrushing the background. If you work in colored pencil, you know that it is a very, very slow medium. And one of the things that's so great about airbrushing a background is it saves so much time. I spent probably, I'd say 45 minutes to an hour on that background that would have taken me 8 hours to do in colored pencil. So it's a great time saver. If you're a little bit hesitant thinking that the airbrush looks really hard, getting the blurry background is the easiest thing you can do with the airbrush because you're not having to get the fine detail. The fine detail is harder to do with the airbrush, but this blurry background, really simple. So I do recommend giving it a try if that's something that looks interesting to you. I do have a tutorial showing you guys how to use the airbrush, so I will put a link to that or a card that'll pop up so you guys can see how to get the blurry backgrounds with that airbrush. Onto her hair. The thing that you want to watch with hair is, well, really two things. One, put as much time as needed into the detail in the hair. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people make when they do portraits is that they rush over the hair. They don't put the detail. They put all their detail in the face and the eyes, but skip or rush over the hair thinking it's not as important. It is as important. If you rush over that, it really pulls down the overall quality of your entire piece. The other thing is that you don't want to try to draw in each individual strand of hair. Detail for the sake of detail does not make something look more realistic. You want to think of hair more in terms of clumps, not individual stringy strands. While I will go through and put in a few individual strands, especially along the outer edges and overlapping onto her face, it's not everywhere. So definitely watch out for that. One of the things that I like so much about the Luminance colored pencils is their white and cream colors are so opaque, so they really show up very well against the brown. The Polychromos colored pencils are very translucent, so while that's great for some things, when I want those more opaque colors, I will always switch over to my Luminance. Make sure you're paying attention to your reference photo and getting all of those little strands of hair going in the right direction. When I move on to her skin, I'm going to be using Burnt Ochre 10% first everywhere. Then I'm going to use Burnt Sienna 50% over some of the shaded areas, and then the much darker areas I'm going to switch over to French Gray. I'm using 130 and 10% on that French Gray throughout the skin. After I get that done, I will blend it out with paint thinner, and then I'm going to repeat that process, the same colors, to make sure that I've got good coverage. And then I go over it with a white Luminance pencil, and then blend that out. And that's how I'm getting that really smooth skin look. So I'm avoiding that grainy, gritty crayon look that's really common with colored pencils. Onto her eyes, I am using my lavender gray, or violet gray, Luminance pencil for the whites of her eyes. They're not actually white. And then for the iris, she's got blue eyes, but I don't want to use an actual blue pencil. If I use a lot of blue in there, they're going to look very unnatural. Blue eyes are almost always, with very rare exception, going to be mostly gray. For the rest of her skin, on this side of her face, I'm doing it the same way that I did on her forehead. Burnt Ochre 10%, Burnt Sienna 50%, and then the French Gray, I blend it out with paint thinner. Repeat that process, blend it out with paint thinner, and then go over most of that with white. And then blend that out with paint thinner. Now, for the later areas when I'm blending out with paint thinner, I have very, very little paint thinner on my brush. I can't stress that enough. If you've got a lot of paint thinner on your brush when you're several layers in, you will end up lifting too much of the colored pencil off the paper and you get a very blotchy look. So to get that very smooth look, I am instead getting the paint thinner on the brush, and then I let it dry out for a few minutes before I actually touch the paper with it. The earlier layers, I can have tons of paint thinner on it, no problem, like right here where I'm doing the nose. That had a lot of paint thinner on it. But my next layers, I need to use less and less paint thinner to get a smooth look. Now, one of the reasons that you're going to see me jump around when I'm working on a portrait is that it makes it easier for me to judge my values when I've got areas around the whatever area I'm working on filled in. So the eye, now that I've got the nose filled in and the cheek, I was able to go back through and see, okay, I need darker shadows here. So that's why I jump around quite a bit. This eye is done the same way as the other one, mostly focusing on shades of gray. Blending that with the paint thinner. You do not need to use expensive brushes for this. I'm using a Taklon bristled brush that is filbert, so that means that the tips are rounded. But a generic cheap brush works just fine for this. Now that I have both eyes in, I go back and forth to make sure that I've got their values the same. Onto this section of her face, it's exactly the same as everywhere else. First, burnt ochre 10%, burnt sienna 50%, and then the French gray. Blend it out with paint thinner, repeat, blend it out with paint thinner again, and then add white on top of that and blend it out with very, very little paint thinner. The rosy color that you're seeing in her cheeks is the Polychromos Dark Flesh. Now that dark flesh, is the title of that is a little bit misleading. I would not use that as a base color for skin. It is way too pink. But for these little blushed areas, it's perfect. For her ear, I am using the same colors that I used everywhere else. I don't have to get tons and tons of detail in here because most of this is going to be covered by her hair, but I do need to get the colors blocked in first so that I can layer the hair on top of it. For the flower, I need to make sure that the yellows that I'm using are the exact same shades as the yellows that I used in the background. As I work, I'm not getting tons and tons of detail any area until the very end of the piece. I'm just blocking in my color. I will come back through and define my shadows and details a lot better later on. I personally like to get everything blocked in before I worry about all the little details. On her arm, same thing as everywhere else. I will end up coming through and adding more shadows here though, with more grays, Paynes gray, and purple. The big difference in the skin tones, even though I'm pretty much using the exact same colors, it's just a matter of how many of the dark colors I use versus how many of the light colors. But I really want to use the same pencils for every area of the skin. I know you guys are going to be shocked, but this section is done the same way as everywhere else. Burnt ochre 10%, burnt sienna 50%, and French gray on top of that. Now this one does get a little bit different. I've got a bit of turquoise that I'll end up putting on for the bottom shadow section of her arm that is a reflection of her dress. That is the violet gray that I'm going over much of this with. I love that pencil. I go through that one like crazy. That is the one pencil I have, that and white I have to replace regularly with my Luminance. Now for her skin up on her chest, she is wearing a beaded necklace, but I'm going to do the skin first so that I can blend and be very messy with my blending and not have to worry about messing up the beads. If I had done the beads first when I blended the skin, the colors from the beads would have smudged over. Because the beads won't need to be blended with paint thinner, I'm just using burnishing for those, being that they are so small. I want to make sure that skin goes first, beads on top. It just keeps my work nice and clean. That's something that you need to consider when you're working in colored pencil. If you have an area that you know has to be blended in paint thinner, and you've got an area like this with the beads that would easily smudge all over, pay attention to which one you choose to do first. You want to keep your work nice and clean. Now as I start moving on to her dress, this dress has that, is it gingham print? I don't remember how to call it. It's checkered. But that print has a lot of white in it. But the white showing in the dress, because this is cast in shadow, it's not actually white. It's kind of this periwinkle purplish color that you can see that I've got here. You don't want anything really to be white when it's cast in shadow. Pay close attention to your values when you're working on something like this. Now the clothing is another area, much like the hair, don't rush over it. This is another mistake that people make. They'll put so much detail into the face. If this is a piece where your goal is realism, where you've got the detail everywhere, don't rush over those clothes. You want to pay close attention to the shadows in the clothes as well so that they look three-dimensional and realistic. So I'm working on the flower on the dress. I first used Luminance white to block in the petals so that they didn't get too dark when I was shading with other colors. On something like that with the flower, it's a really weird shape, and it's better to think of it as an abstract shape instead of a flower. If you try to make sense of it as a flower when you're working, things just don't come out quite right. So sometimes it's better to look at things as just abstract weird shapes. This section of her skin was done the same way as the other side, where I wanted to do the skin before the beads so that I don't accidentally smudge those dark colors of the beads into the skin tones when I blend with the paint thinner. When I'm working on the straps, that's another area. I've got to be careful not to blend that blue into the skin. It'll look very weird there. So just be very careful when you do blend with the paint thinner. I'm going to blend the blue of that strap separate than her arm. This avoids muddy colors. Onto her hands. When you're choosing a reference photo, be careful or mindful of the position of the hands, because if they're positioned weird, even though you may draw them exactly right, it can really make your end portrait look very weird. So make sure, look at those hands and consider, how is this going to look when I transfer it into a painting or drawing? Are those hands in a weird position? Because sometimes, even if you draw them exact, they'll end up looking like the person's deformed. So just the different position of the hand is really important when choosing your reference photo for a portrait. And her hands were done just like everywhere else. I did them finger by finger first. It made it a little bit easier not to get overwhelmed with all the detail in hands. Hands are difficult. I need to do a tutorial on that for you guys soon. But I know they're one of the harder things to get done right, which is funny because the shapes are very simple, but it's so easy to have them come out looking very deformed. So watch your reference photo, and if you need to, like I did here, I broke it down. Those final layers with the paint thinner, again, there is very, very little paint thinner on that brush. It's mostly dry. Completely dry won't do anything, so you don't want a completely dry brush, but it's very, very, it's not soaking wet like it would be on my earlier stages. Like here, when I blend the skin on that arm, I will have a lot of paint thinner on the brush. But from here on out, I need less and less paint thinner the further I go in order to avoid lifting too much colored pencil off the paper and getting a blotchy look. When you do arms, here's another thing where you want to pay attention to the shadows in the arm in order for it to not come out looking flat. Once I get that in, I worked throughout the rest of the piece and went through and cleaned up my details. Just sharpened everything up that needed to be. I also ended up going back through and adding a bit of purple over portions of her face and her arm. You can see here there's more of a purple tone there, just to strengthen those shadows a bit. Thanks for watching. Again, if you are supporters over on Patreon, make sure to head over there where the 2-hour version of this drawing is available for you guys now. If you're new to my channel, I have new video critiques every Tuesday where I'm critiquing your original paintings or drawings, my own speed paintings, drawings, and tutorials every Wednesday, social media tips for artists each Thursday, and artist vlogs every weekend. So if you haven't already, I would love for you to subscribe so you don't miss out on anything. And you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, Google+, all those social media sites. The links are below in the video description to keep up with news, my newest work, and see real-time clips of whatever it is I'm currently working on. I'll see you guys tomorrow. I used like 50 or 70, a lot of colored pencils on this one. The colors for her skin tone I do have listed below in the video description, because I know you guys love that. I just want to take a moment to show you guys a portrait that I did in colored pencil about a year ago and the one now. Look how much you can improve in a year. To be honest, I never liked that portrait. I gave up early on because I was just sick of working with it and didn't like my reference photo. So that was a lot of bad choices on my part. I'm not proud.